testifying about the DNA found on the gun used to kill Trayvon Martin. We now go to Anthony Gorgone, a crime lab analyst.
From the pistol slide gave a negative result when I tested it for the possible presence of blood. The DNA testing result was not a mixture. It also gave me limited results. However, I was able to make determinations on this. It was too limited for me to match it to any one individual. However, I was able to make a comparison and potentially exclude any individual that I thought couldn't possibly have contributed to the sample. And as far as the comparison to the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, I was not able to include or exclude either of those individuals to that limited sample.
There just wasn't enough there?
I just wasn't able to make a determination. There wasn't enough information of them for them present to make an inclusion, because I wasn't able to make an inclusion to the sample in general, and there wasn't enough of an absence of their information for me to say there's no way that they could have contributed to it.
I believe the fourth swab was taken from the holster itself. Tell us, and that's the last part of this slide that I've shown you. Tell us, if you could, what your findings were regarding that.
The swab from the holster tested negative for the possible presence of blood. The DNA testing gave me a mixture of DNA. I was able to resolve out a major DNA profile for the sample, and that major DNA profile matched George Zimmerman. And the statistical analysis is right here. It's the same 1 in 11 quadrillion Caucasians, 1 in 1.5 quintillion African Americans, and 1 in 57 quadrillion Southeastern Hispanics. That would be for the probability of the major DNA profile. As far as the minor or lesser contributors, I was not able to determine a DNA profile for any of those minor contributors. And when I made the comparison to Trayvon Martin, I was not able to include or exclude him from the mixture.
So as to the holster where you got a major, it matches George Zimmerman, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you then also examine fingernail scrapings from Trayvon Martin taken at the medical examiner's office?
I did.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes, you may.
Sir, I'm going to show you what's been, thank you, Your Honor. State's exhibit number 191, and I ask you if you recognize State's exhibit 191, sir.
I do. The outside packaging has my Florida Department Law Enforcement case number, barcode label, my initials, and the date. The two internal packages also have my initials and the date.
And these are not, at least when I look at them, they don't appear to be Q-tips in terms of a little swab at the end. Is that correct? What are these? It's
a wooden scraper stick. It has one pointy edge, and that edge is used to scrape down in between the fingernail and the skin to try to obtain any kind of foreign DNA that might be present under someone's fingernails that might have happened during an encounter or a struggle.
Okay. And so as to State's Exhibit 1, I'll get the right number here, 181, I believe. I'm sorry, yes, 191, excuse me. This would have, you can identify it as coming from the fingernail scrapes from a medical examiner's office, Trayvon Benjamin Martin. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, may I publish these to the jury?
Yes, you may.
And we are going to take a quick break. We'll be right back right here on MSNBC with the George Zimmerman trial.
Even though you don't have a swab, how do you...
And back to the crime lab analyst who is giving further testimony there in Sanford, Florida.
The outside also contains my barcode, FDLE barcode label.
And are these two exhibits the swab from the Skittles and also from the flashlight? Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. And are they labeled as such? Does one say a bag of Skittles and the other one say flashlight on it?
Yes. Each box was labeled, and then I took and labeled them A and B.
Your Honor, may I publish that to the jury?
Yes, you may.
In other words, the box itself has labels as to where they came from. One says Skittles and the other one says Flashlight. Is that correct?
Yes.
If we could, I want to ask you about your results for findings regarding those two exhibits, sir. Specifically, let's talk about the, thank you, Your Honor. Let's talk about the swab from the Skittles bag. What were your findings regarding that, sir?
The swab from the Skittles bag gave a positive result for the possible presence of blood. It was a single source DNA profile. It was a partial DNA profile, meaning I got less than the areas. These two samples, I tested 15 areas. It's 15 loci as opposed to the 13 on the rest of the samples in this case. So I got results at less than the 15 locations. However, that partial DNA profile did match Trayvon Martin, and the probability of finding that DNA profile at random would be 1 in 100 quadrillion Caucasians, 1 in 160 trillion African Americans, and 1 in 18 quadrillion Hispanics.
I want to move now to the swab from the flashlight recovered at the scene. If you could, what were your findings regarding that exhibit?
The swab from the flashlight gave a negative result for blood, and I was not able to obtain any DNA results from that swab.
Sir, I now want to move to some analysis you did of a sweatshirt or hooded sweatshirt. Do you recall doing analysis? And I'm showing you for the record, State's Exhibit 118, a photograph. Do you recall doing analysis on that exhibit, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay. With the court's permission, may we turn on the lights for, we're going to show the actual exhibit. So thank you, Your Honor. And just going to go, the court's permission, step down, Your Honor.
Yes, you may. Please step down, sir. You don't remove it.
John Burris, Lisa Bloom still with us. As we look at what's being discussed right now, John Burris, and the issue here of DNA on the gun, key perhaps to the storyline that Trayvon Martin had reached and perhaps touched the gun that George Zimmerman had. What are you hearing from the lab analyst? At one point, he was saying he could not include nor exclude DNA in his analysis. What's your thought, John?
Well, that's my thought. I mean, I thought initially that it was going to be an exclusion totally of Trayvon, but I didn't really get that from him. I get that there wasn't enough samples there for him to include or exclude. So in that sense, it's neutral. It was designed to impeach, if possible, Mr. Zimmerman's claim that he had reached for the gun, but I don't really see that. So I don't hear that. So what you really have is the DNA on things that are pretty obvious. We're going to probably go to the sweatshirt. We also went to the Skittle cans. So at the end of the day, I don't know that this really carries the day in terms of one way or the other. The prosecution ultimately has to put this evidence on, but I don't think it goes necessarily to the question of guilt or innocence of Mr. Zimmerman.
Lisa, does this information that you've heard so far, this inclusion-exclusion statement made by the lab analyst, does it help the prosecution?
It's another piece of incremental evidence that helps the prosecution. I get two takeaways from this testimony. One is that the DNA expert says there is no DNA from Trayvon Martin on the gun. Although some samples were too small to measure, there was one good sample, and Trayvon Martin's DNA was not on it. And secondly, that there's no foreign DNA, meaning there's no George Zimmerman DNA under Trayvon Martin's fingernails. And that one, I think, is even more significant because although George Zimmerman mostly claims that Trayvon Martin did not touch the gun. In most of his stories, he says he simply reached for the gun. He certainly says that Trayvon Martin was punching him, was assaulting him, was putting his hands over his mouth, and yet no George Zimmerman DNA anywhere on Trayvon Martin's hands. So I think that is significant.
That is significant. John Burris, when you heard that information about no DNA there on George Zimmerman's hands, what do you make of that?
Well, I don't know that I would say that that is conclusive, that never happened. I think we do have the notion that Trayvon's hands were on him. That doesn't necessarily mean that DNA would be left. Obviously, it's important if you can exclude it and argue it from the prosecution's point of view, but I think the defense can argue it as well, so far indicating that it's not conclusive on that point, that disproves Mr. Zimmerman's claims. It doesn't necessarily prove it, but it doesn't disprove it.
John, Lisa, stand by. Craig Melvin, who has been watching this case for us there in Sanford, Florida, outside the courtroom, has more information for us right now. Craig, what are you hearing?
You know, Richard, in another sign, I suppose that the defense is getting ready to start its case. The state has, just the past few moments, we found out that the state has filed what's called a motion of limine regarding expert testimony. Now, in layman's terms, apparently, essentially, this means that the state is trying to restrict the scope of some expert testimony that is going to be offered by the defense when the defense starts its case. I'm going to read to you really quickly from the motion here. The motion is specific to a defense witness named Dennis Root. According to the motion, he was deposed on June 29th, and he, quote, now offers himself as an expert in various law enforcement-related topics, including the use of force. The motion goes on to say that during the deposition, Root says that the defendant, George Zimmerman, was reasonable in his use of deadly force against Trayvon Martin. Goes on to say that the defendant did not violate any Florida statutes as well. But again, this is a motion that was filed by the state in an attempt to limit some expert testimony that we expect to hear when the defense launches its case.
Craig Melvin, thank you so much outside the courtroom there in Sanford, Florida. Lisa Bloom, John Burris, thank you so much. Our big story, George Zimmerman and the trial today. We continue to watch that here on MSNBC. And, of course, what is happening in Egypt, all coming up. The cycle is next. Stay with MSNBC.
Breaking news right now in the cycle, day 8 of testimony in the George Zimmerman trial, and this is going to be a long one. The prosecution tells the judge they plan to rest today. Will we hear from the parents of Trayvon Martin? Also breaking news from Cairo, night falls and tensions rise among the Egyptian people. Army tanks join protesters in Tahrir Square. The Muslim Brotherhood claims a military coup is underway. We're live there this hour. But we begin inside the most watched courtroom in America right now. A crime lab analyst is testifying about DNA from both Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. Let's listen in.
Front and back of the outside surface.
And then you said you're also tell us about this, what you're doing here at the cuffs.
The same thing. It was all collected with one swab. The cuff area to here.
Okay. And there was nothing foreign to Trayvon Martin. In other words, you didn't find another person's DNA on those, either one of those.
Correct.
Thank you, Mayor. Ma'am, take it back. Thank you, Your Honor. Did you do then examination or analysis on the sweatshirt that Mr. Martin was wearing underneath that hooded sweat jacket?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And do you see before you a photograph of State's Exhibit 120, sir?
Yes.
And did you perform or attempt to perform analysis on that exhibit, sir?
I did.
Okay. I'm showing you State's Exhibit 121, which I believe covers the bottom part of that sweatshirt. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the bottom front surface.
Okay. And there appear to be, I'm circling as best I can, some numbers, or I'm sorry, some letters with some circles. How did those get there?
I put those circles there when I was visually examining the item for any red-brown stains that could possibly be blood, other than the large red-brown stain around the hole in the upper left-hand side. Those are any stains other than that I circled to perform the chemical test and then possibly do DNA testing on those stains.